Mr. President.
I recognize the Majority Leader.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent the quorum call be suspended.
Without objection.
Mr. President, Zach Didier was a good student, an athlete, and musician. He was an Eagle Scout, starred in the school play, and he was hoping to attend Stanford University. But 2 days after Christmas in 2020, Zach's dad found him dead in his bedroom of fentanyl poisoning. He was 17. Zach and his friends had gone to the mall to meet a drug dealer they had found through social media. He bought what he thought was Percocet, but it wasn't. The counterfeit pills he bought contained fentanyl, and what was a bad decision became deadly. Mr. President, Zach was one of the more than 90,000 Americans who died of an overdose in 2020. Many of those deaths from fentanyl poisoning. He was one of countless victims of fake pills being peddled on our streets. Pills that too often find their way into the hands of young people and steal their futures. Courage Mittens is another tragic story. Adopted from Ghana, Courage was pursuing his dream of becoming an airline pilot. He had attended flight school, interviewed for a job just days before he died at age 23. Courage's parents found him on their couch after a night out with friends, seemingly asleep until he stopped breathing. As they later found out, Courage had taken a pill with 2 times the lethal dose of fentanyl in it. Ashley Romero, a 32-year-old mother, took half of what she thought was a painkiller. But that half a pill contained a deadly dose of fentanyl. And the dealer who had supplied Ashley's boyfriend with the pill that took her life is believed to have sold pills that killed several other people. One of those individuals was Jonathan Ellington. Jonathan had become addicted to OxyContin when it was prescribed to him for a high school soccer injury. He got clean and stayed clean for about a decade until another injury and another prescription got him back on it. When his prescription ran out, he bought some pills from an acquaintance. It only took 1 pill with a lethal dose of fentanyl to take Jonathan's life. Mr. President, these are just a few of the stories that families have shared with the Judiciary Committee in support of the HALT Fentanyl Act. Unfortunately, there are many more like them. Lives lost, futures destroyed, families changed forever. 1 in 3 Americans know someone who has died of a drug overdose. We're losing young people, teenagers, young parents, people with bright lives ahead of them. Mr. President, when the Trump administration temporarily classified all fentanyl analogs as Schedule I substances, law enforcement gained a critical tool to combat fentanyl and go after the people who are bringing this poison into the United States. Congress has extended this temporary classification several times because it works. Now we need to make it permanent by passing the HALT Fentanyl Act. I was very pleased at the strong bipartisan vote this bill received last Thursday, and I hope the vote on final passage will be equally robust. As I said, classifying all fentanyl analogs as Schedule I substances gives law enforcement a critical tool to go after the criminals bringing this poison into our country and selling it on our streets. And it joins other efforts to end the fentanyl crisis in our country. President Trump is taking significant steps to halt the supply of drugs flowing across our borders. Senator Blackburn has done great work bringing attention to the role of social media, which is often the link between teenagers and drug dealers. And the Senate will continue working to stop fentanyl from taking more American lives. Mr. President, fentanyl has caused too many tragedies. I'm grateful to the families who've lost loved ones to this deadly drug for sharing their stories. And the HALT Fentanyl Act is moving forward due in no small part to their support. Mr. President, I yield the floor, and I suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks.
Mr. President,
I recognize the Democrat leader.
I ask unanimous consent the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, yesterday afternoon, Elon Musk confirmed what many of us have been warning about for a long time. Republicans are getting ready to gut Social Security and Medicare. Let me repeat that. Elon Musk confirmed what many of us have warned about. Republicans are getting ready to gut Social Security and gut Medicare. Here's what he said. During an interview with Fox Business, the richest man on earth repeated again a bevy of lies that entitlement programs tens of millions of people rely on are riddled with fraud and abuse. That's a pretext to slashing them. But it's false. He added, most of the federal spending is entitlements. That's true. So that the big one to eliminate. So that's the big one to eliminate, meaning Social Security. Let me quote Elon Musk again. That's the big one, Social Security, to eliminate. It's rare to hear Republicans tell the truth about their plans so directly. What Elon Musk is saying is that sooner or later, Republicans are going to target people's Social Security and Medicare benefits. The outrage that the richest man in the world would tell millions of seniors who depend on those checks each month that it's fraud, that it's waste, is outrageous. He doesn't have any idea the harm it would do. And it isn't fraud. Donald Trump, Elon Musk, and Republicans know that the math on their billionaire tax cuts will not work without going after these benefits. And all they care about is cutting their taxes further. Outrageous. As America begins to hear this, America is going to realize what a bad bargain Donald Trump was in the election. It's another awful reminder that under Donald Trump and Elon Musk and Republicans, billionaires win, American families lose. There's something truly rotten about the Republican agenda when a multi-billionaire, the richest man in the world, is allowed to lie so casually about one of America's most sacred programs in order to justify taking benefits away from hardworking Americans. Few programs have done more good, have helped more people, have been more popular than Social Security has for nearly a century. Few programs are as beloved by Americans as Social Security. Americans, of course, support eliminating waste, but they do not want to see their Social Security benefits get taken away. How is Elon Musk trying to do this? He's using the oldest trick in the book, shamelessly lying about Social Security, just as Donald Trump did in his State of the Union address, where he listed hundreds of people who were born 100 or 20 years ago and couldn't show a single one was getting Social Security. Musk is shamelessly lying about Social Security, claiming it's riddled with fraud in order to justify taking benefits away from seniors and retirees. He ignores the very bold, plain fact that the federal government has already conducts an audit of Social Security every year. It's a legit audit, not a partisan audit. It's been done during Trump's presidency and Biden's presidency. What did it find? Less than 1%, less than 1% of all payments from 2015 to 2022 were made in error. That, Mr. Musk, is not what fraud looks like. He cherry-picks data to suggest that tens of millions of dead people are getting checks. This is a lie. And to be sure, this isn't just about Elon Musk's rhetoric. The assault on Social Security is taking shape in practice. DOGE has already taken over the Social Security Administration agency and has free access to the private data and benefits of tens of millions of Americans. The Trump administration has already begun to fire 7,000 staffers, which means local offices will shut down, customer service wait times will explode, the risk of delayed benefits will skyrocket. So I ask my Republican colleagues, you all fine with this? Are they fine with Musk calling Social Security one giant scam? Let's find a single person here on the Republican side who starts rebutting Musk once and for all when they know he's doing what the American people hate and is not telling the truth. Do our colleagues agree with Musk's lie that hundreds of billions of dollars in outright fraud has compromised Social Security? Mark my words. If Elon Musk and Doge continue their attacks against Social Security, if the president continues his attacks, which he made in the State of the Union, sooner or later benefits are going to be delayed, mistakenly halted, and the political uproar from Americans from one end of the country to the other, red, purple, and blue, will be immense. And more trouble for the Trump administration. The Trump economy. Donald Trump promised Americans a golden age on day one. Well, today's day 50, and Americans are wondering, scratching their heads, where's this golden age? You can't find this golden age in the inflation numbers because inflation has gone up under Donald Trump from groceries to retail to cars. The idea that he said in the campaign prices will begin going down on day one, that's by the wayside, that's for sure. You can't find this golden age in the stock market either. We know the stock market is Donald Trump's favorite measuring stick. But right now, because of him, his actions, his erraticness, his own actions have plunged markets and therefore people's retirement accounts into chaos. Yesterday, the Dow fell by almost 900 points, 2%. The S&P plunged 4%, 2.7%, and the NASDAQ composite, the tech composite, fell by 4%. Why is this happening? One reason, President's tariffs on Canada and Mexico. But the other is pure chaos. No stability, no certainty for businesses, total confusion in the economy. One thing businesses tell us, they want certainty and they want stability. One thing they're getting from Donald Trump, uncertainty and chaos. And because starting this foolish and chaotic trade war, on again one day, off again the next day, Donald Trump has single-handedly poured a bucket of ice water on the economy. Trump thinks he can just yak. Oh, I'm for it, and then the next day I'll say I'm not for it. But businesses can't plan that way. If they think there's a chance he'll come back and do it, they don't plan, they don't buy, they don't go forward. Businesses right now are in a state of total confusion. They have no idea what Trump is going to do next. Is he going to impose tariffs today, tomorrow, next month? How big will they be? What countries? What products? Every day you hear a different answer on something that is so important to the American economy and the world economy. American consumers are also anxious. If you don't know what tomorrow will bring, you're going to spend less today. Donald Trump himself knows that tariffs will hurt working families. When asked on Fox Business about the possibility that his tariffs could trigger a recession, he refused to even downplay the possibility it can happen. This was a rare moment of truth from Donald Trump. He said, yeah, my tariffs may cause a recession. And then he seemed to say, his body language said, who cares? Amazing. The guy who said he'd lift the economy not only is beginning to cause the beginnings of an economic downturn, but he seems to be proud of it. Wow. Is that what America bargained for? I don't think so. When Donald Trump says there's an utter period of transition, it's just gibberish. What Donald Trump means when he says period of transition is that I will hurt you slowly, not all at once. It means, yes, my tariffs will raise prices on the American people. Donald Trump knows his tariffs could wreck the economy, but he's doing it anyway, all so he can use the income from tariffs to pay for tax cuts for billionaires, his North Star. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
I recognize the senator from Wyoming.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I come to the floor having just listened to the minority leader of the Senate come to the floor and listen to what he had to say. You know, it's been 10 weeks now, Mr. President, that Republicans have been in the majority and the Democrats have been in the minority after the historic victory in November. The contrast is pretty significant. Senate Republicans made promises to the American people, promised to get the country back on track. We're keeping that promise. We are hitting the ground running, and we're not turning back. Most importantly, for our successes, it has been because Republicans have remained united. As a result, we have a list of accomplishments, as opposed to what we just heard the minority leader talk about. First, the Senate has now confirmed all 21 members of President Trump's cabinet. And we did it at a record pace. Faster pace than the Democrats were able to do for President Obama in 2009, faster than they were able to do it for President Biden in 2021. The pace with which Republicans have confirmed President Trump's nominees to the cabinet, and as Politico pointed out today, all completed before the Senate has taken a break. That's where we are today, historic speed. With this team in place early, President Trump is able to execute effectively and efficiently the popular agenda for which he was elected. The Senate has prioritized confirming the president's national security team. You know, we saw horrific attacks in New Orleans, New Year's, continue to see chaos around the world. We need a national security team in place, and we prioritize that, and we've done it. The Senate also passed the Laken Riley Act. It's now law, signed by the president. It is the first significant piece of immigration enforcement law signed in decades, and just in the first number of weeks. It's actually the first bill that President Trump signed into law as the 47th president of the United States. It's going to save lives. It's going to prevent human tragedy like we saw happen in Georgia to that young nursing student. I'm very grateful to Senator Katie Britt of Alabama and Senator Ted Budd of North Carolina for their leadership in finding the bipartisan way to get this bill passed. We've also focused on our shared agenda with the House and with the President. We moved quickly to pass a budget that's focused on border security, energy security for our nation, as well as America Peace Through Strength. Budget Committee Lindsey Graham, who was chairman of the committee, and his members of committees did groundbreaking work, all focused on making America stronger and better, more secure. Senate Republicans are working with the House on a path forward now, and working closely with Senator Mike Crapo of the Finance Committee, who's leading the charge to make sure we're not facing a $4 trillion tax increase, is what the Democrats want. They want Americans to suffer the pain of $4 trillion in additional taxes. This is very important work to keep taxes low for hardworking families and continue to stimulate the economy. I heard a lot from the minority leader about 5 minutes ago. He was talking about the future of Medicaid and of Medicare, and I'm a doctor. I work closely with patients on all of those programs. But what I heard Senator Schumer do as he stood right there, it sounded to me like he is threatening to shut down the government. He sounds like somebody who's going to tell his members, vote against keeping the government open. We are so distraught that the fact that President Trump has been elected, so mad at the voters because they elected a Republican House and a Republican Senate, as well as sent President Trump back to the White House, that we just want to say, the heck with you, we're going to shut down the government. It costs money to shut down the government. It costs money to reopen the government. It impacts services for the American people. Democrats are so mad. You saw it the last week when the president made his speech to Congress, to the joint session, his address to the nation. The way they acted during that statement by the commander-in-chief, those are people that are just mad at the voters. The American public liked what the president had to say that night. Overwhelmingly, those that saw the speech saw it as very positive, happy with the direction of the country, happy with the leadership of the president. Feel he's focused, he's forceful, he's effective, energetic, getting the job done. It's not what we hear. That's not what I heard from the Senate Minority Leader just a few minutes ago. Sounded like somebody that's going to command the troops, hey, shut down the government because we're mad and we're going to take it out on the American people. Well, let me set the record straight, because Republicans support Medicaid. Republicans support Medicare. Just the other night, we passed Senator Dan Sullivan's amendment to protect and to preserve Medicaid and Medicare. Not a single Democrat joined us. These programs are in trouble today. Why? Because of the previous administration. Joe Biden weakened them by making them available for scammers. And that's what's happened. People are sucking money out of these programs who don't deserve to be doing it and are taking the care needed from hardworking American families. Republicans want to protect and preserve and strengthen Medicare and Medicaid. We want to do it for the people these vital programs were originally intended for, not for the scammers. Stopping scamming is a big part of this. Additionally, when I take a look at some of the things we've done over the last several weeks, Mr. President, is that we have reaffirmed our friendship with Israel. Intelligence Committee Chairman Tom Cotton of Arkansas, Foreign Relations Committee Chairman Jim Risch of Idaho, they introduced bipartisan legislation to impose severe sanctions on something called the International Criminal Court. It's an illegitimate kangaroo court that targets Israel and does the bidding of Iran. Sanctioning the ICC would have sent a very strong message to the world. The message, of course, being America stands with Israel. Senate Democrats filibustered it. 45 Democrat senators chose to abandon our closest ally. Senate Republicans also successfully blocked destructive Democrat legislation attacking American energy production. Democrats actually tried to reverse President Trump's national energy emergency. America clearly faces an energy emergency. Energy prices went up 31% during the last 4 years under the Democrats' administration of punishing American energy. Well, led by Chairman Mike Lee from Utah, Republicans are taking the handcuffs off of American energy. Look, we know that unleashing American energy will help kickstart our economy. Senate Republicans also voted to protect girls and women in sports. Senator Coach Tommy Tuberville of Alabama has been a champion of women's sports in the Senate. His legislation was common sense to over 80% of Americans. It said biological men should not be allowed to compete in women's sports against our daughters, our sisters. Simple as that. Democrats filibustered it. They are completely out of touch with the American people, the Democrats are, and they are putting our female athletes in harm's way. Senate Republicans also have erased some burdensome Biden regulations. We're cutting through the red tape, cutting red tape most significantly on American energy production. At the same time, we're also protecting America's financial freedom. Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana led efforts to end a Biden regulation on energy production in the Gulf of America. Senator John Hoeven of North Dakota led efforts to cut $7 billion in natural gas taxes on our energy producers. Senator Pete Ricketts of Nebraska led the efforts to rein in unaccountable bureaucrats from snooping in your digital wallet. Democrats wanted to spy on everything you buy or do on Apple Pay, on Venmo, Zelle, with other apps. Senator Ted Cruz of Texas led efforts to push back against IRS attacks on cryptocurrency. Look, each of these resolutions passed the Senate in spite of Democrat opposition. By reversing these heavy-handed rules, Republicans are making life more affordable for American families. And this week, the Senate is moving to pass life-saving legislation. It's called the Halt Fentanyl Act. 70,000 Americans are poisoned or killed by illicit fentanyl each year in the United States. It's the #1 killer of Americans between the ages of 18 and 45. The Halt Fentanyl Act will aid efforts to crack down on drug dealers and criminal cartels that smuggle the poison into our country and into our communities. I'm grateful that Leader Thune is putting this bipartisan legislation up for a vote. Mr. President, you can sum up these early weeks of the Republican-led Senate in 3 words: fast, forceful, and effective. We weren't wasting time. We're not wasting time. We're just getting started. Working together, Republicans are going to deliver for the American people. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
I recognize the senator from Illinois.
Mr. President, today stands out as a critical moment for the country, the Supreme Court, and the Constitution. In recent weeks, Trump administration officials and allies have made statements and engaged in troubling conduct that threaten judicial independence and our very system of government. Elon Musk, a senior advisor to President Trump, has repeatedly called for the impeachment of federal judges whose decisions he disagrees with, and he's questioned the lifetime appointment of federal judges that is enshrined in Article 3 of our Constitution. In a social media post, Vice President J.D. Vance falsely asserted that, quote, judges aren't allowed to control the executive's legitimate power, end of quote. This is merely the latest in a long line of claims by the Vice President that a President of the United States can defy the orders of the court. In 2021, Mr. Vance went so far as to say he would suggest to President Trump that, quote, when the court stops you, stand before the country like Andrew Jackson did and say, the Chief Justice has made his ruling, now let him enforce it. This was an obvious reference to the apocryphal story about President Andrew Jackson, suggesting he would defy the Supreme Court ruling. And President Donald Trump himself recently posted, and I quote, he who saves his country does not violate any law. Let me repeat that personal post by the President. He who saves his country does not violate any law. Mr. President, those 10 words are a rationale for tyranny and are an assault on our Constitution. This disregard for judicial review has not been limited to words alone. In multiple cases, administration officials have dragged their feet or failed to comply with federal court orders. The administration has also nominated individuals to senior positions at the Department of Justice who seem to have little regard for separation of powers. One Trump nominee recently testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee and said, and I quote, there is no hard and fast rule about whether in every instance a public official is bound by a court decision, end of quote. Fortunately, my colleague, Republican Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana, admonished this nominee and he said, and I quote, don't ever take the position that you're not going to follow the order of the court, ever. Now you can disagree with it within the bounds of legal ethics. You can criticize it, you can appeal it, or you can resign, end of quote. And it's only the executive, isn't only the executive branch that has threatened the independence of the judiciary. In the past month, 3 members of the House of Representatives have introduced articles of impeachment against federal judges for no reason other than they ruled against this administration. These actions and comments constitute a clear and present danger to the separation of powers and our Constitution. Instead of favorably quoting the apocryphal words of Andrew Jackson, our political leaders and their allies should reference the words of Chief Justice Marshall in Marbury versus Madison, an 1803 decision. As we all learned in law school, Judge Marshall said, and I quote, it is emphatically the province and duty of the judicial department to say what the law is, end of quote. There has been a broad bipartisan consensus on that point for more than 2 centuries when it comes to interpreting and applying the law. The judiciary has the final word. Last week on this floor, I tried to pass a Senate resolution simply affirming the rule of law and finality of judicial review. I thought and hoped every senator would support it. Regrettably, a Republican senator objected, and the Senate missed an opportunity to say with one voice that we support the Constitution and judicial branch. Thankfully, the judicial branch has demonstrated its independence even without the support of the other branches of government. Judges have carefully considered the cases before them, and in some cases provided a check on the administration when it overstepped. For that, I commend the judiciary. Alexander Hamilton called the Article III judiciary, the courts, quote, the least dangerous branch, close quote, because it has neither soldiers nor money to enforce its decrees. That's why the court's legitimacy in the eyes of the American people is so critical to its continued vitality. And that's why I continue to support an enforceable code of conduct for the Supreme Court. Recent efforts by the Trump administration and its allies to intimidate and impeach federal judges have been based on those judges' decisions and the president who appointed them. In contrast, an enforceable code of conduct would apply to all justices equally, no matter who appointed them and no matter how they rule on a particular matter. I first proposed that the court adopt an enforceable code of conduct 13 years ago in 2012, prior to the existence of the court's current conservative supermajority and prior to many of its controversial decisions. The fact that many sitting justices have publicly endorsed an enforceable code of conduct underscores that it does not pose a threat to the independence of the judicial branch. An enforceable code of conduct would bolster public confidence in the judicial branch. And by ensuring the judiciary is held in high regard, we can ensure that the so-called least dangerous branch of government maintains a position of strength now and in the future. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks.
Senator from Iowa.
Ask that the quorum call be suspended.
Without objection.
Soon we'll vote on the nomination of Gail Slater to serve as Assistant Attorney General for the Antitrust Division. I support her nomination, and I urge my colleagues to do the same. Antitrust is important to me as it is to most senators. I've long been concerned about market concentration and anti-competitive practices in industries that impact Iowans, whether it's agriculture or healthcare or technology. These issues don't get the most attention around the United States Senate, but they still impact millions of Americans. Family farmers and independent producers deserve fair prices for their products. Seniors deserve affordable prescription drugs. Children deserve to be safe from predatory behavior on dominant tech platforms. All of these are antitrust issues. Attorney General Bondi told me during her confirmation process that she shares my interest in these issues and that she'd work with me and the Antitrust Division to address these issues. There's no better person to help her in this project than Gail Slater. Ms. Slater has the right qualification for this job. She spent several years practicing antitrust law in private practice before spending a decade at the Federal Trade Commission handling antitrust investigations and litigation. In these roles, she learned the nuts and bolts of antitrust enforcement. Ms. Slater also understands antitrust and economics from a policy perspective. You know, she served in President Trump's first administration on the National Economic Council, and she served now Vice President Vance as his economic policy advisor and a member of his Senate staff. So, Ms. Slater has numerous accomplishments in the antitrust space. I'm not the only one who thinks Ms. Slater is the right person for the job. She has received letters of support from 9 previous heads of the Justice Department Antitrust Division. These men and women were appointed by presidents of both political parties, and they wrote, quote, "Ms. Slater has the experience, intelligence, judgment, and leadership skills necessary to serve as an excellent Assistant Attorney General for the Antitrust Division," end of quote. Another bipartisan coalition letter commends her, quote, "unique ability to collaborate on a bipartisan basis with stakeholders across the political spectrum, building coalitions towards common goals," end of quote. And it might surprise you that the International Brotherhood of Teamsters announced that they support her nomination. In a rare sign of unity in the Judiciary Committee I share, where we don't get a lot of unity, Ms. Slater was advanced out of committee by a 20 yes vote to 2 negative votes. I hope for a similarly strong bipartisan vote here on the floor. The Antitrust Division will flourish under Ms. Slater's strong leadership, and I'm proud to support her. She's ready to serve our country, and we need to get her confirmed quickly. I yield the floor, suggest the absence of quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks.
President.
Senator from Massachusetts.
Mr. President, are we in quorum call?
We are.
I ask that the quorum call be lifted.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Donald Trump and co-president Elon Musk are shutting down the federal government one piece at a time. Shutting down the agency that stops banks and payday lenders from cheating working people. Shutting down children's cancer research. Shutting down key parts of the Department of Transportation, the agency responsible for keeping people safe when they're flying airplanes. Even shutting down parts of the Social Security Administration. And now, Republicans in Congress are laying out their blueprint to shut down the entire federal government. A budget is a reflection of our values, and this proposal makes clear where the Republicans' values lie. After months of bipartisan talks, they're walking away from the negotiating table and offering a non-starter House bill that forces us to the brink of a full government shutdown. And who would be hurt the most? Working people. Billionaires win, families lose. Republican values are clear. Their shutdown bill does two terrible things. First, it wipes out the guardrails that Congress wrote for how to spend taxpayer money. That means that co-presidents Trump and Musk can hold everyone under their magic spell. They can spend taxpayer money or they can shut off taxpayer money exactly how they want. Perhaps Trump and Musk want to shovel $75 million of ALS treatment funding to anti-vaccine research instead. That would be okay under the Republican deal. Or maybe they want to shift $300 million or more from the FAA's telecommunications funding bucket toward contracts to Elon Musk Starlink. The budget Republicans have sent over would permit that as well. And if Trump and Musk decide to fire another 25,000 veterans or kick 1 million old people out of nursing homes, this package from House Republicans would say, sure. In addition to giving co-presidents Trump and Musk the power to spend taxpayer money wherever they want, the House Republicans also propose general cuts. Cuts from programs that help families put food on the table, afford child care, and keep our communities safe. Cuts from local communities for projects like improving hospitals, teaching facilities, and child care centers. Dollars that the House and the Senate had already agreed to. But the House Republican package isn't just about cutting out veterans and old people. No, it's also about spending more money. Republican House members want to pour an extra $6 billion over the next 6 months. Yep, that's $1 billion a month directly to the Pentagon. No explanation, no justification of why this money is needed. Nope. Cuts everywhere else in government, but a funding increase for the one government agency that has never passed an audit. That agency, the Department of Defense, gets $1 billion a month. House Republicans want to give $6 billion more to make sure that defense contractors continue to get their fat paychecks. Look, Republicans in Congress don't care whether the government shuts down because they don't care about hurting working families. All they care about is getting back to jamming through their true agenda. $4.6 trillion worth of tax handouts for millionaires, billionaires, and giant corporations, paid for by gutting health care for millions of people. Donald Trump looked Americans in the eye and said he'd, quote, lower costs on day one. Those were his words. And now we are 7 weeks in, and he has done the exact opposite. He is raising costs for families. More people are losing their jobs. Sky-high child care, housing, and food costs. And it's open season right now for banks and credit card companies and shady student loan outfits to scam the American people. The Republican shutdown playbook is dangerous, and it will hurt working families. Democrats are right to oppose the House bill, and people all across this country are right to expect us to stand up and fight back. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor, and I suggest the absence of a quorum. Oh, I just yield the floor.
President.
Senator from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. President. I come to the floor this morning to speak in opposition to the nomination of Steven Bradbury. He's nominated to be the Deputy Secretary of Transportation. When it comes to transportation safety, we don't measure success in dollars saved. We measure success in lives protected and tragedies prevented. Last week, I met with the parents of Sam Lilly, the first officer of the American Airlines plane that fatally collided with a U.S. Army Black Hawk helicopter at DCA Airport. Sam's father happens to be a commercial pilot now, and before that, he flew Black Hawk helicopters in the military. He expressed his concern about reports that the Black Hawks are regularly being operated in this busy airspace without the automatic dependent surveillance broadcast, commonly known as ADSB, turned on. We know that the Black Hawk in the January 29th collision wasn't transmitting. This kind of technology would have allowed the CRJ and Sam Lilly the ability to see that traffic. We hope that we will find out later today in the NTSB report that is listed what we need to do to fix this problem. We know that during Mr. Bradbury's first tenure at DOT, he let the FAA create exemptions to permit military aircraft from operating without this key safety technology transmitting. And guess what? The military knew that they had been granted a loophole, but they said it would not be used all the time, only to find out later that the military said they were going to use the exemption 100% of the time. My heart goes out to the Lilly family and to all the families of the victims of this tragic accident. It didn't need to happen. That is why last week I wrote Secretary Hegseth to ask about the Army's letter from 2023 stating that 100% of its helicopters fly in the DC area with this ADSB technology not activated. We can't afford another light touch approach at the Department of Transportation when it comes to safety. We cannot. It simply does not matter if you're saving dollars if you're not saving lives. Unfortunately, I believe the President's nominee to be Deputy Secretary of the Department of Transportation, Steven Bradbury, has shown more interest in a light touch approach that benefits industry than being a champion for safety. During his nomination hearing, I questioned Mr. Bradbury about his record as previous general counsel for the Department of Transportation during the first Trump administration. In this capacity, Mr. Bradbury played a key role in orchestrating the rollback of multiple safety requirements under the guise of advancing a reform agenda. For example, under his watch, he prevented requirements for truck drivers. There was a fatigue prevention requirement for truck drivers, which he loosened. The vehicle safety recall investigation reached an all-time low. and meanwhile, road fatalities increased. Under his watch, there were a number of rail safety requirements that were also waived. The Department of Transportation withdrew its two-person crew rule. This was a rule that people had recommended after derailments in the United States and in Canada, including a runaway oil train in Quebec in 2013 that derailed and killed 47 people. And during the same time period, the mainline derailment rate increased, all during Mr. Bradbury's tenure. Perhaps, though, the most troubling of all is Mr. Bradbury's watch during the rulemaking on what is called a safety management system for aviation manufacturers like Boeing. Just 9 days after the first 737 MAX crash in 2018, which resulted in 346 deaths, there was a rule that said, being proposed, that the safety management system should be a mandatory requirement, not voluntary. Don't tell an industry that has to manufacture planes, it's okay, you can voluntarily comply with some of these rules. No, we need requirements that manufacturers must meet. As my colleagues on the Commerce Committee know, a safety management system rule for aviation manufacturers would have instituted a comprehensive process for analyzing, predicting, and ultimately mitigating risk. The safety management system is considered the gold standard now around the world. If you want to have safety, you have a safety management system. It's a more robust process. And I question how Mr. Bradbury at DOT, after the first Indonesian 737 MAX crash, didn't see or understand the need for critical information and analysis that a safety management system would have put in place, particularly because the FAA continued to let the MAX plane fly, and part of the process in question is whether they considered the critical analysis that Boeing had done to allow the plane to fly and what the FAA's role was. So following the tragedies of both 737 MAX crashes, the Commerce Committee, led by then Chairman Wicker, launched an investigation into the crashes to find solutions and prevent the disaster from happening again. But what did Mr. Bradbury do? Did he work with the committee to improve safety for the flying public? No, he did not. He basically thwarted Senator Wicker and the committee's efforts to get the information about what the FAA had done. Make this clear here today. Our colleagues need to hold the FAA accountable. If you don't hold the FAA accountable as the oversight body, fat chance the FAA is going to continue to do its job as aggressively as it needs to. So, Senator Wicker's office said, quote, Mr. Bradbury intentionally withheld relevant information requested by the committee, end quote. He made our investigation very hard. In fact, Senator Wicker later said, quote, he deliberately attempted to keep us in the dark, and by that I mean our investigations, our staff, our committee, and me, end quote. Now, I have great respect for my colleague, Senator Wicker, but the Bradbury's findings in stymieing us as a committee to do our oversight job gives me serious questions about his level of transparency. The families of the 737 MAX crashes wrote to Chairman Cruz last month to express their concerns about Mr. Bradbury's role in obstructing the committee's investigation into the crashes that took their loved ones' lives. They also voiced concern about Mr. Bradbury's role that led to the delays in holding Boeing accountable to implementing a true mandatory safety management system. Now, during his hearing, Mr. Bradbury suggested that the rule that was proposed by the previous Obama administration that made it mandatory for manufacturers to have a safety management system was held up because some small businesses didn't want to meet that requirement. Do we not believe that businesses are going to object to some rules? They do. They do all the time. But that doesn't mean scrapping the rule altogether, which is exactly what happened as far as the mandatory requirement. Well, lucky for the consumer, our committee, in the aftermath of these two crashes, got legislation passed that said, yes, you have to have a mandatory safety management system. And you have to, FAA, put that rule out. Now, Mr. Bradbury was still serving as general counsel and acting deputy secretary of the department. You would have thought, now that he's gotten a directive by Congress to put out this rule, he would have said, hey, we have one. We've been debating it for a while, but now we've had two crashes. It's really clear that the safety culture needs to be upgraded. Everybody agrees, all experts, this is the great system, let's implement it. But he didn't. He didn't move forward, even after Congress mandated it. And after Mr. Bradbury's confirmation hearing in front of the Commerce Committee last month, the families of the 737 MAX crashes released a statement saying his testimony purporting to prioritize aviation safety, quote, shows a complete disregard for the 84 people who died in plane crashes in the United States in the last month, end quote. But Mr. Bradbury's troubling record doesn't stop just with transportation. During his time at the Department of Justice during the Bush administration, Mr. Bradbury authored what we now know now as the widely known torture memos, justifying the use of waterboarding and other torture techniques. The Department of Justice, in the Office of Professional Responsibility, reviewed these memos and raised doubts about them, quote, saying the objectivity and reasonableness, end quote, of these legal analysis. DOJ also found evidence that Mr. Bradbury's legal analysis, quote, were written with the goal of allowing the ongoing CIA program to continue. So Mr. Bradbury then, at the Department of Justice, was writing rules that fit the outcome that he wanted instead of looking objectively at what the American people needed. These legal opinions were contrary to what this nation stands for. Later, the Senate refused to confirm Mr. Bradbury as Assistant Attorney General during the Bush administration, and Congress passed the McCain-Feinstein Amendment to the 2016 NDAA, codifying the illegality of those torture methods, those very torture methods that Mr. Bradbury said were okay. We passed a law to basically change what this guy's legal opinion was because it was so bad. And so now, when the Senate is asked to provide advice and consent on Mr. Bradbury's nomination to be General Counsel of the Transportation Department, I think you should look back at what happened then. Two of our Republican colleagues voted against his nomination because of the torture memos. They rightly concluded that he was not right to fit in the Department of Justice role. I'm saying today, what do you need to know? He didn't fight for strong safety rules at the Department of Transportation before. He's not going to fight for them now. It's really clear that our aviation safety system needs strong leadership at the FAA. Not someone who's going to write the rule to fit business, but write the rule to fit safety. As if these issues weren't concerning enough, there is another issue. During his confirmation hearing, I asked Mr. Bradbury what about the conflicts of interest that appear to be mounting between Elon Musk and the FAA? You know, I thought a smart lawyer, because your job is to be general counsel, could really give guidance to the Secretary of Transportation, give guidance to the FAA administrator, the acting one, and could say, these are the ways in which Elon Musk should not pass go, would be a conflict of interest, would be a problem at the FAA, given that there are already issues that are really clearly in front of us. So I said, tell us, where do you think those conflict of interests exist? Of course, at the hearing, he kind of demurred. And I said, you know what, Mr. Bradbury, you can give me for the record, where exactly do you think there's a conflict of interest? But he didn't just evade my answers. He basically said that he thought that it was an excellent idea to have Elon Musk and SpaceX making changes to the FAA air traffic control system. In fact, he said that he didn't, quote, see the potential for a conflict, end quote, with the SpaceX employees having access to the FAA. Of course, we know now that 3 SpaceX engineers were recently hired as special government employees at the FAA and were immediately granted conflict of interest waivers by the Trump administration so they could work on matters at the FAA. Why? Because they had, quote, direct and predictable effects upon the financial interests of SpaceX, end quote. So in other words, the Trump administration conceded that conflicts of interest do exist, and they're going to let them happen anyway, and they went to get a waiver. The conflicts of interest for Mr. Musk and SpaceX at the FAA is obvious. Let me just say, though, first, you can have all sorts of broadband solutions, including satellite solutions. But when you're talking about the air traffic controller system, that kind of system is inferior to fiber. Why? Because of speed, capacity, cost, weather, all sorts of issues. And when there's chaos, we need certainty and predictability. So we are seeing a conflict play out right before our eyes. According to a Bloomberg report, one of SpaceX engineers who was granted a conflict of interest waiver recently told the FAA that SpaceX planned to send 4,000 Starlink terminals to the agency. For what? We're still trying to find out. The FAA already entered into a $2 billion contract with Verizon in 2023 to upgrade its telecommunications network. But Mr. Musk's own tweet suggests he wants to cancel the FAA's contract with Verizon. He's saying that they are failing. He wants them to use his product instead. And yet, Mr. Bradbury apparently doesn't even see the potential. He doesn't even see the potential for the conflict of interest. It doesn't stop with Starlink as a broadband supplier. Just last week, SpaceX Starship heavy lift rocket malfunctioned and broke apart over the Caribbean before it reached orbit. Dangerous debris fell from the sky. The FAA smartly halted flights in the area to ensure safety, and thankfully no one was injured. The FAA initiated an immediate investigation into SpaceX to determine what happened. The investigation presents another clear conflict of interest. As we know, Mr. Musk doesn't think FAA safety rules should apply to him. Last September, the FAA fined Mr. Musk and SpaceX for failing to comply with specific requirements in its launch license. Afterwards, after getting fined, Mr. Musk made a spectacle calling for the firing of the FAA administrator. That's right, the FAA fined him, and then he called for the FAA administrator. Oh, wait 1 second. The FAA administrator that passed this body 98-0, because everybody here thought he was going to do a great job. But Mr. Bradbury doesn't think Elon Musk has a conflict of interest, but Elon Musk can basically say to the President of the United States, fire the FAA administrator that we all said we thought would do a good job. Now, we all know Mr. Whitaker wasn't going to stick around and put up without being backed up for the safety work that he was doing. And now we don't have a Senate-confirmed head of the FAA. Why? Because Mr. Whitaker didn't want to stay around if everybody was going to let Donald Trump do whatever the heck he wanted when it came to the FAA. All this because he got fined for violating safety rules. So, I really don't understand what Mr. Bradbury doesn't understand, that he can't write down on a piece of paper where real conflict of interest exists. We need new leadership in the Department of Transportation so that we can continue to stand up to safety issues. I do not believe Mr. Bradbury is that person. Mr. Bradbury sees bureaucratic hurdles when other people see safety safeguard. He sees red tape where we see life-saving protections. He sees the objective of having a light-touch FAA, and we see the objective of having safety be the primary purpose, because you can't win at aviation if you don't win at aviation safety first. Ask the people of the Pacific Northwest. The catastrophes of the MAX crashes not only lost lives, they cost billions of dollars. So not adhering to safety is hardly a winning economic solution. So Mr. Bradbury hasn't shown us the leadership on safety. He has not shown the fidelity of upholding the law, of even respecting Congress. He has not shown us the courage that it takes to stand up and make sure that safety is implemented. And the consequences of putting the wrong person in place are measured in human lives, not dollars. Human lives. The Boeing 737 MAX families know this. Yesterday was the 6th anniversary of the Ethiopian Airlines crash that claimed 157 lives. Family members like Javier de Luis and Nadia Milaron, who have now oriented their lives around making aviation safer. I so appreciate their advocacy, but the people at the FAA should be doing the same. I urge my colleagues to vote against the nomination of Steven Bradbury, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to complete my remarks prior to the scheduled roll call vote.
Without objection.
Well, Mr. President, it's another week in Washington, and I think maybe the 52nd day since President Trump was inaugurated. And we're seeing the compliant mainstream media continue to spread falsehoods about the work of the Department of Government Efficiency and Elon Musk. As I've said before, the federal government has a spending problem. And like with any addiction, getting clean and solving that problem is not necessarily easy or comfortable, but it is long overdue and absolutely necessary. With the national debt at $36.2 trillion and counting, we have to start somewhere, and little things add up. And what better place to start than the waste, fraud, and abuse that DOGE is identifying? This has long been a bipartisan issue. I can think of everything dating back to the Grace Commission, where waste, fraud, and abuse was a bipartisan target, but apparently not with President Trump in the office and not with Elon Musk in charge of the effort to identify the spending. If you take a look at most things that the federal government is cutting at the recommendation of DOGE, it becomes harder and harder to become a DOGE skeptic, unless you're just blind to what they are doing. Last week, I mentioned the waste that DOGE had identified with subscriptions and software licenses. And people may think, well, that's no big deal, but there's no reason taxpayers should be footing the bill for expensive subscriptions that go unused. DOGE uncovered the potential for massive fraud with an audit they conducted of government credit cards. At the beginning of the audit, there were 4.6 million active government credit cards, 4.6 million. After 2 weeks, DOGE identified nearly 150,000 credit cards that were thankfully unused or unneeded and closed both down. And I'm sure there's more to be done with 4.6 million active credit cards. There's no reason for so many government employees to have direct access to spending taxpayer money at the click of a button or swipe of a credit card. This is basic and would never happen in the private sector or in our individual lives. But the federal government, before this administration and before DOGE, these were commonplace and have been overlooked for way too long. There's some instances of fraud that we've known about for some time, but it's taken the Trump administration and DOGE to identify it and fix it. For example, the Government Accountability Office submitted a report to Congress last April, estimating that the federal government loses between $223 billion and $521 billion every year as a result of improper payments. The federal government's making improper payments and spending potentially up to $500 billion. Naturally, this was an opportunity for DOGE to identify this waste of taxpayer dollars. DOGE found payments to illegal immigrants using multiple Social Security numbers to submit Medicare claims, something for which they are not legally entitled. They found $57,000 in Medicare payments in 2020 for a patient who actually was recorded to have died 14 years earlier. It's amazing. You can continue to charge for Medicare payments 14 years after your death. In one particularly egregious instance, an illegal immigrant with a warrant out for her arrest was receiving more than $100,000 in loans from the Small Business Administration. But the waste and abuse of tax dollars goes beyond mere inefficiencies. Some of the other line items on the DOGE cutting floor are so patently absurd, it would make your blood boil. For example, last week, the National Institute of Health canceled more than $500 million in grants for transgender experiments on mice. You can't make this stuff up. It's stranger than fiction. In a similar vein, NIH also canceled millions in woke grants ranging from promoting healthy relationships among transgender youth to delivering transgender services via telehealth. I think if you ask most taxpayers how they'd like their money to be spent, these programs would not make the cut. But that's not all. NIH is also canceling research grants that were going to universities in China. They canceled a grant for $1.7 million going to the Peking University in Beijing for the, quote, China Health and Retirement Longitudinal Study, close quote. Once again, I think American taxpayers would prefer to focus on things here at home, including their own retirement savings, rather than sending millions of dollars to China to study health and retirement security in a country which is our chief geopolitical rival. But that's not all. The list goes on. A group called the Inter-American Foundation has been significantly reduced after DOGE found egregious misuse of tax dollars, including over $900,000 going towards alpaca farming in Peru. That's on top of $800,000 for vegetable gardens in El Salvador, and more than $700,000 to improve the marketability of mushrooms and peas in Guatemala. I know that children frequently squirm at the dinner table when they're told they have to eat their vegetables, but I don't think this is an area where most people think our tax dollars should be spent. Unfortunately, this waste doesn't stop at the vegetable aisle. This foundation also spent more than $600,000 to expand the sales of fruit and jam in Honduras, as well as nearly $500,000 on improving the production of artisanal salt in Ecuador. Artisanal salt in Ecuador. Well, thank goodness the Department of Government Efficiency and Mr. Musk were key to identifying these egregious abuses of the taxpayer. But they've been going on for a long time until the Trump administration came along. So I'm grateful that now some of these outrageous expenditures of tax dollars are being exposed and dealt with. As I said earlier, Washington, D.C. has a spending problem. And like any addiction, it's hard to kick the habit, especially after you become adjusted to it. But it's time for a little cold turkey when it comes to this addiction. And many people who benefit from this gravy train don't want it to end. So naturally, many of our colleagues on the other side are concerned about DOGE, and they want to suggest that everything the federal government does is absolutely perfect. They wouldn't change a thing. But they don't really have any real substantive response to these outrageous examples that I'm mentioning here. They wouldn't change a thing. They see these stats and they tell you, don't believe your lying eyes. But those of us who've looked into it, who've taken the time to study what's been exposed, know otherwise. The government is not infallible. We have an unsustainable level of federal debt that threatens our economy and our national security. And the truth is, the Trump administration and Republicans are hard at work trying to address it to make the government more efficient and more affordable for American families. So once again, I'd like to do something that you don't hear very often here in D.C. these days, and thank Elon Musk for his service to our country in performing this essential and long overdue role. Mr. President, I yield the floor. Consent to waive the mandatory quorum call with respect to the Bradbury nomination.
Without objection. The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the nomination of Steven Bradbury of Virginia to be Deputy Secretary of Transportation, signed by 17 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the nomination of Steven Bradbury of Virginia to be the Deputy Secretary of Transportation shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Alsobrooks, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Banks, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Ms. Blunt-Rochester, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Britt, Mr. Budd, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Lee. Thank you. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Curtis. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Thank you. Ms. Ernst. Mr. Fetterman. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Gallego. Thank you. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Haggerty. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Hickenlooper. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Husted. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Justice. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kem. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Langford. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lujan. Ms. Lummis. Mr. Markey. Mr. Marshall. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McCormick. Mr. Merkley. Mrs. Moody. Mr. Moran. Mr. Marino. Mr. Mullen. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Paul. Mr. Peters. Mr. Reed. Mr. Ricketts. Mr. Risch. Ms. Rosen. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schiff. Mr. Schmidt. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Sheehy. Ms. Slotkin. Ms. Smith. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Thune. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Tuberville. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warnock. Ms. Warren. Mr. Welch. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Cornyn, Crapo, Daines, Gallego, Grassley, Lee, Lummis, Moody, Ricketts, Sheehy, and Sullivan. Didn't I say Graham? Yeah. Oh. Guess who? Mr. Graham, aye. Senators voting, thank you, in the negative: Fetterman, Hassan, Heinrich, Klobuchar, Lujan, and Sanders. Mr. Curtis, aye. Mr. Scott of Florida, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Mr. Cassidy, aye. Mr. McCormick, aye. Mr. Welch, no. Mr. Marshall, aye. Mr. Rounds, aye. Mr. Husted, aye. She's got it all worked out. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Kelly? No. Ms. Hirono? No. Mr. Bennett? No. Mr. Langford, aye. Mr. Warner? No. Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, aye. Mr. Grassley, aye. Mr. Wyden? No. Ms. Warren, no. Ms. Ernst? Aye. Mr. Markey, no. Mr. Merkley, no. Mr. Kane, no. Ms. Cortez Masto, no. Mr. Padilla, no. Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. Booker, no. Mr. Schiff, no. Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Ossoff, no. Mr. Schatz, no. Ms. Cantwell, no. Mr. Peters, no. Mr. Whitehouse, no. Mrs. Murray, no. Mr. Kennedy, aye. Mr. Haggerty, aye. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, aye. Mr. Reed, no. Mr. Murphy? No. Mr. Blumenthal? No. Mr. Schumer? No. Ms. Rosen, no. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mr. Cruz, aye. Mr. Barrasso, aye. Mr. Hawley, aye. Mr. Hickenlooper, no. Ms. Smith, no. Ms. Blunt Rochester, no. Mr. King, no. Mr. Marino, Aye. Mr. Gallego? Mr. Gallego, no. Mrs. Capito? Aye. Mr. Kim? No. Mr. Banks, aye. Mrs. Blackburn? Aye. Mrs. Britt? Aye. Well, Mr. Cotton? Aye. Mr. Warnock, no. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Tuberville, aye. Mr. Mullen, aye. Ms. Also Brooks, no. Mr. Schmidt, aye. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Coons, no. Mr. McConnell, aye. Mr. Kramer, aye. Mr. Tillis, aye. Mr. Budd, aye. Mr. Johnson, aye. Mrs. Fisher, aye. Mr. Van Hollen, no. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. Paul, no. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, no. Mr. Durbin, no.
Motion is agreed to. Under the previous order, the Senate stands in recess until 2:15 p.m. Okay, I know you guys will miss me.